so far in the Lam Rim, we've looked at the initial level of how to make our life meaningful, and that is to strive for a good future. So the first two reflections were to help us to develop the aspiration to strive for a good future, and the second two reflections on refuge and karma are designed for us to adopt an ethical lifestyle. And by adopting an ethical lifestyle, that will create the causes for having a good future. Because what we saw from the karma presentation is if we avoid harmful behaviour, we engage in virtuous behaviour, will create the causes to have a better life in this life and in future lives. So this ethical lifestyle is the basis for achieving a good future, this life and future lives. But then, of course, we can understand that even though we may end up in a good situation in this life and future lives, we're still stuck in this state of dukkha, this unsatisfactory state of dukkha. So then we can go to the next level of making our life meaningful. Not only striving for a good future, but striving to break free of the cycle altogether. So we see that in the three types of persons chart. Someone of medium capacity or middling capacity has as their goal what's called definite goodness here. Definite goodness is just a term to describe a state beyond suffering altogether. And here we talk about liberation. Liberation, we're talking about, of course, nirvana, to achieve personal liberation from suffering. So here also, we first need to develop the aspiration to strive for that goal. And so here we see in the chart, there are two topics in the Lam Rim to reflect on to help us to even develop the aspiration for nirvana. And the first one talks about reflecting on suffering and its origin. So of course here we're talking about the first two noble truths. To reflect on the first noble truth, the truth of dukkha, and to reflect on the second noble truth, the truth of cause or origin of dukkha. To understand the situation we find ourselves in, to really appreciate we're stuck in this state of dukkha and that it's coming from our mental afflictions. And if we can really internalize that, we can understand that these mental afflictions are something we can eliminate from our mind. And thereby, reflecting on this, we can develop this aspiration of renunciation. That we, remember this renunciation is the aspiration for striving for the goal of nirvana. Here in your chart, you also see it talks about reflecting on the 12 links. The 12 links also is a presentation that sort of describes in a very elaborate way how we are stuck in this cycle. And that's actually on one of your handouts. This one here, this wheel of life. And we won't go through these 12 links, but the 12 links are these 12 diagrams around the outside of this circle here. So this diagram is describing in some detail how we are stuck in this cycle. Particularly these 12 links describe that very well. And a lot of the information on this diagram is described on the back, so you can have a read of that in your own time. But this is a complete sort of topic in itself. But those 12 links describe how we're stuck in this cycle, but also how to break free of it. So by reflecting on these 12 links, we can also develop this aspiration, this renunciation, wishing to break free of this cycle.
Which one, the number one?
The one up the top here, the person with the stick.
And then it
goes around like a clock. So it's basically like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, like that, the 12 links. So this is another reflection we can do to help us to develop this aspiration of renunciation, the wish to break free of the cycle altogether. And of course, once we have cultivated this renunciation, the wish to break free, then we need a method to actually break free. And so we see then in your chart, the method or the path are the 3 higher trainings. So the next topic in the Lam Rim are the 3 higher trainings. And as we saw yesterday evening in the 3 vehicles chart, the 3 higher trainings were ethics, concentration, wisdom. So here, at this level of practice, striving for nirvana, also we have an ethical foundation. On that basis, we develop single point of concentration. And then with that single point of concentration, we do our vipassana practice, the wisdom practice, primarily coming to realize the wisdom of no self, no autonomous self here. So if we can realize this no autonomous self, then that realization will lead us to the goal of nirvana. So that is, at the next level, how to make our life meaningful, to actually strive for the goal of liberation altogether, the goal of nirvana. Does anyone have any questions about that level of practice?
12 links is like bad things?
The what, sorry?
The 12 links?
So, yeah.
In general, are the causes of suffering?
So the 12 links are these diagrams around the outside. Okay, maybe I'll spend just a few brief minutes describing them very quickly, because this is a whole topic itself.
Oh, just in general, this is the causes of suffering?
It's the, remember in this one, the suffering and its causes chart, we had seed of ignorance producing ignorance, misconception, attachment, aversion, action, suffering. The 12 links is a little bit more elaborate version than that. It describes a couple of other steps in the process. So it's a similar idea to that.
How is the wheel of life connected to the mental factors?
Mental factors?
Not mental factors, sorry.
Mental afflictions?
Yes.
The first link is ignorance. That's a mental affliction.
Okay.
The second link is action. But then if we go further down, we have down the bottom here, link 7 is person with an arrow stuck in their eye.
Yeah.
That's feeling. So there's a lot of feeling going on there. And we saw in that suffering and its causes, pleasant, unpleasant feelings lead to attachment, aversion. So link 8 and 9, the link 8 is a person drinking alcohol, so that's craving. And link 9 is a monkey grabbing fruit from the tree, is grasping. So craving and grasping are like intense forms of attachment.
Mm-hmm.
And they're listed here because that craving or grasping is actually what activates one of these imprints when we're going through the death process to cause the next rebirth to take place. So these are the mental afflictions that are mentioned in the 12 links, particularly those.
So the connection is
Connection with
the mental. Just that if those 12 are the things that.
it describes, these 12 links in particular describe the process of how we are stuck through ignorance, mental afflictions and actions. In particular, how they lead to birth after birth after birth.
But aren't that what the 26?
Well, 26 are just mental afflictions. This is describing the actual process. How we go from life to life because of mental afflictions and actions. So this is the process for that. So this is a particular presentation of ignorance to mental afflictions to actions to results. It's the presentation that shows that process, how that works in propelling us from life to life.
So mental afflictions are just part of what makes us suffer.
Well, they're one of the causes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
fine.
Anything else from this level of practice? Anyone would like to ask? Okay. So at this level of making our life meaningful, then we are striving for the goal of nirvana, personal liberation from suffering. But then here we can understand, well, we're not the only ones stuck in this mess. Everyone else is. So then we can expand our motivation further. And our motivation to not only want to liberate ourselves from suffering, but to also have a motivation of wishing to help to liberate everyone else from suffering. So that expanded motivation is the third level of making our life meaningful. Someone of so-called great capacity. So someone of great capacity is now expanding their motivation to not only strive for the goal of nirvana, but to strive for the goal of enlightenment. Because if we achieve the goal of full awakening, enlightenment, we can be most effective in helping others. So again, here, the first step is to actually even develop that aspiration for enlightenment, which of course is called bodhicitta. How do we go about developing bodhicitta? Here we see there are two presentations in the Lam Rim. There are two methods or two presentations to help us to cultivate this aspiration of bodhicitta. The first method is called the 7 cause and effect method. And the second one, as we see here, is called equalizing and exchanging self and others. Now, historically in India and Tibet, this was the more common technique or approach that was used or taught to help develop bodhicitta, the aspiration. This technique, I think, or approach can be a little bit problematic in our modern society for two reasons. In this approach, which says there are actually 7 steps to the process, the very first step can create some difficulties. Because the very first step, for the logic to work in it, it assumes a belief in rebirth. So if we don't have a belief in rebirth, the logic in the first step doesn't really hold. And also in the first step, the step is to see everyone as our mother. The logic being, of course, is in this life we have a mother, in the previous life we had a mother, and we keep going back. And the logic is, if we keep going back, then we can understand that actually everyone has been our mother at some point. The idea being that the mother is the one who has helped us most in our life. So if we can see everyone as our mother, we can develop a sense of closeness to everyone. But of course, if we don't believe or accept rebirth, that logic sort of falls down. And also, unfortunately, in our modern society, many people have problems or issues with their mother. So if we start to see everyone as our mother, we might start hating everyone. So the text says that, well, if we have difficulties with our mother, then substitute father, brother, sister, caregiver, some teacher, some other person who's benefited you. The second technique, and that's the one I want to explain here, was not so widely taught in India and Tibet because it was considered too difficult for the average person. But actually I think this is the more powerful technique, the one that really can help us in our modern society. And this technique does not require any belief in rebirth for it to be effective. So I want to focus on this technique. So both of these techniques, if we go through them, that will result in us cultivating bodhicitta, the aspiration. So the outcome of these practices or processes is that we develop this aspiration of bodhicitta to aspire for the goal of enlightenment. So I'd like to now look at the equalizing and exchanging self with others. And these techniques are based on what's called the four immeasurables, which also come a little bit here. So I'd like to briefly present the four immeasurables. These are four qualities we're cultivating that are the basis for these two techniques. And the word immeasurable here means we're cultivating these qualities towards immeasurable sentient beings, immeasurable living beings, meaning all living beings. The first quality is loving kindness, in Sanskrit Maitri, in Pali Metta. We also already briefly saw this the other day. And that loving kindness, of course, remember, was the wish for ourselves and others to be happy. Or, in other words, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Very similar to that is, of course, compassion. Sorry? So, the four immeasurables in the Theravada traditions are often called the four Brahma Viharas. In the Mahayana traditions, they are usually given the title the four immeasurables. Same. The second quality is compassion. In Sanskrit, karuna. Compassion is defined as the wish for ourselves and others to be free of suffering and its causes. So, of course, immeasurable loving kindness and immeasurable compassion is the wish for all living beings to have happiness and its causes. It's the wish for all living beings to be free of suffering and its causes. It's recommended we cultivate these in stages. First, cultivate these toward people who are close to us, most easy. Once we've developed these qualities to people close to us, slowly expand it out to people we don't know very well. Once we're comfortable with that, slowly start expanding it out to people we find difficult, and then eventually toward all living beings. That's usually the steps mentioned in the text. I think in our modern society we need to add one more step at the very beginning, and that is to cultivate loving kindness and compassion for ourselves. Because unfortunately in our modern society we tend to have an epidemic of low self-esteem and self-hatred, so if we're not kind and compassionate toward ourselves, we won't be able to extend that out to others. So developing these in stages. The third quality is empathetic joy or mudita. And empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. And I think this is something also critically important in our modern society, because we're always focusing on the negative with respect to ourselves and others. And we're often doing that also with cognitive fusion. So to have a more balanced view of ourselves and others, we need to focus on our own and others' virtue and good fortune and rejoice in that. So empathetic joy is this rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. The fourth quality is equanimity, in Sanskrit upeksha. And equanimity is a impartial attitude towards everyone. Now, of course, our attitude towards others is very biased. And we tend to categorize people into three groups, depending on how they affect us. We tend to, for those people around us who seem to support me in my happiness, we label friend. Those people around us who don't seem to affect me and my happiness in any way, stranger. And those people around us who seem to interfere with me and my happiness, and maybe even seem to cause me suffering, the so-called enemy. Once we've categorized people into these three groups, solely on the basis of how they're affecting us, we develop a very biased attitude. Because to the friends who seem to be the source of my happiness, we end up with a lot of attachment. To the group, the strangers who don't seem to be affecting me in any way, we often develop a lot of apathy and indifference. And to the so-called enemy who seem to be interfering with me and my happiness, we often develop a lot of hostility, anger, and hatred. So we end up with attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, hostility, anger, hatred to the difficult people. Equanimity is about overcoming this biased view through understanding that we're all stuck in the same situation. We're all struggling to be happy, all struggling to be free of suffering. We're all equal in this regard, and thereby develop a sense of closeness to everyone. And if we can develop that, then we can really develop immeasurable loving kindness, immeasurable compassion, immeasurable empathetic joy much more easily. So these are the four immeasurables. These are the qualities that we develop as a basis for going on to developing bodhicitta. Any questions about that before I go into looking at this equalizing and exchanging technique?
Just if you can repeat yourself about the empathetic joy.
Yeah. So empathetic joy is a rejoicing in our own and others' virtue and good fortune. Fourth, equanimity is impartiality. It's to develop a sense of closeness to everyone. That we're all equal in wanting to be happy, wanting to be free of suffering. And it's to overcome attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, aversion, anger, hatred to difficult people.
I have a question about the medium capacity.
About?
The medium capacity?
Yeah, sure.
The reflecting on suffering and its origin
And its causes.
and its causes.
Yeah.
Is it just meditation? Is it the same like with the death and with the...
Yeah. So we can reflect on, like a meditation could be to reflect on this dukkha, the dukkha of suffering, the dukkha of change, the all-pervasive dukkha. To reflect on that, to internalize that, to really understand what that really means, to get a little taste of what dukkha really means.
Are there stages in there, the same as there were stages in the death and in the...
Stages. What do you mean by
When you
stages?
were explaining about the understanding of death,
Yeah.
you were showing us...
Oh, the 9-point death
Yeah.
meditation? Yeah. So yes.
So there are certain meditations.
Yeah, there's different ones, and what you find in the Lam Rim, particularly in the more extensive presentations, you'll find a number of different presentations that look at these things from different perspectives to get a very broad understanding of that. So you'll find that in the Lam Rim, yes.
Two questions. First one is, we learned about the 7 causes and effect, or
You mean now?
we've learned about it?
No,
No.
no.
You said something about it and I didn't hear.
Right. What I said was that this technique was the main technique that was presented in India and in India and Tibet as the method for developing bodhicitta. But what I suggested was that this technique, to use this technique now, can be a little bit difficult because it assumes you believe in rebirth. Because the very first thing to reflect on is that everyone is our mother. But if we don't believe in rebirth, we can't really see everyone as our mother. It doesn't make any sense.
Yes, but what is the meaning of cause and effect by this?
Oh, okay. It means that there are actually 6 things that we look at in order, and the result is bodhicitta. So very quickly, the 7 cause and effect, the 7 steps are, the first is see everyone as our mother. Through understanding that we've had a mother in every life, to develop a sense of closeness.
Oh, so there are 6 causes and 1 effect? And
Really,
this is the
yeah.
7?
Yeah. So the first is to see everyone as our mother. The second point is to remember their kindness. The third step is then, based on that, to develop a wish to repay their kindness. And then from that third step, the 4th and 5th step is to develop great love and great compassion for all mother sentient beings. And then to understand, on that basis, the 6th step then is what's called altruistic intention, which is to make it our personal responsibility to help liberate all mother sentient beings. So on the basis of having great love and great compassion for all mother sentient beings, the 4th and the 5th step, from that we develop the determination to make it our personal responsibility to liberate all mother sentient beings. I think the voice is going again.
Slowly.
Slowly, yeah. Then, at the 6th step, we have the altruistic intention. The intention to liberate all mother sentient beings. But then we can understand, in our current condition, what can we do? Not much. So, therefore, we can understand it's only if we achieve enlightenment that we can effectively help to liberate. So then we go on to develop the aspiration of bodhicitta. So that is the 7th point, the result of those 6. So 7 cause and effect are the 6 steps leading to the 7th step of the actual aspiration of bodhicitta.
Another question I have is you taught us yesterday, you divided all of the stages that we learn in the Lamrim, you divided it to different vehicles.
Right, good point. So, the initial, the good future, the first capacity, plus the medium capacity, together, equivalent to Theravada.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to understand is you said that this is the Gulu school.
Gulu school, yeah. Right.
So the Gulu school actually...
Mahayana.
This is Mahayana?
Right. So
we did... okay. No, so,
right. So therefore, the Mahayana includes all of the Theravada practices. So here in the Lam Rim, the first two levels that we looked at, the small or initial capacity and the middling capacity, all of those practices is equivalent to the Theravada level.
Yes, but there's also the Vajrayana.
Right, that's still coming. We haven't got there yet.
So the Gulu school just is collected from all these traditions?
Well, these are vehicles, I mean the Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, and they're really levels of practice. And the Geluk school, like all the Tibetan schools, incorporate all three levels of practice.
Yes, but I didn't understand it only as levels of practice, but also as different traditions.
Correct. And so the Theravada traditions would only go as far as here.
So the Gulu school just collected all these traditions and made this...
No, is that the Mahayana traditions include all the Theravada stuff. It's not like they're taking the Theravada stuff and bringing it in. It's just that Theravada is like one-story building. Mahayana is two-story building. So in a two-story building, you have the first floor and the second
but
floor.
you have also the third one.
And Vajrayana is like a three-story building.
And this is also...
Yeah. So Lam Rim includes all of those elements. So the Theravada level is what we've already described, the first and second. In the third level, the great capacity is Mahayana and Vajrayana is there. The Mahayana and Vajrayana levels of practice, as we're going to see shortly. So now we're looking at the Mahayana. Previous to that, all that stuff was equivalent to the Theravada level of practice, because the goal up until here was Nirvana. Now we're talking about the goal of enlightenment. So these practices are within Mahayana, and then finally we're going to look later at the Vajrayana level of practice. All of this comes within the Lam Rim.
The three vehicles had given by the Buddha? Or?
The Buddha didn't say, here's the three vehicles. The Buddha wasn't a philosopher. He was a doctor. So he taught according to people's capacity. So to these people he taught this, to these, this. So he taught many different things to many different people. And then after the time of the Buddha, the great Indian philosophers looked at all this stuff and tried to systematize it. Because otherwise, if we wanted to practice, we just have hundreds of sutras. Where do we start? This one or this one, or what do we do? We don't know. I mean, of course, if we've got the Buddha, we go to the Buddha and say, what should we do? And he'll say, you do this. Great. But if you don't, you need a system to make sense of all of this. So these systems were developed by great Indian philosophers and systematized into systems. And so then we have then coming out of that the Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana systems of levels of practice.
So I'm right, everything had given by
From
Buddha.
yeah, but the Buddha didn't say, here's Mahayana, here's Theravada, here's Vajrayana. He never...
All those teaching given
Yeah,
by Buddha.
that's right. Okay, let's look at this practice now. This technique, equalizing and exchanging self with others. So this is a 5-step method. On the basis of this, to develop the aspiration of bodhicitta. So that's the goal, to develop this. Oh, actually, there's one more thing I wanted to mention on the four immeasurables which can be very helpful. And that is, with each of those four immeasurables, we have what's called the near enemy, which is something that looks like that immeasurable, but actually it's opposite, and it interferes with developing it. One of them we've already seen yesterday, and that is loving kindness. The near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. It sort of looks like loving kindness, but actually interferes. So we are to identify that and get rid of that. Now, fortunately, even though each one of these four immeasurables has its own near enemy, one of the other four immeasurables is helpful to overcome that near enemy. So, the near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. It seems to be, loving kindness, but actually it's polluting it. It's causing problems. So if we find that our loving kindness is degenerating into attachment, then it's good to reflect on equanimity. Because remember, equanimity is this impartial attitude. It's to overcome attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, anger and hatred to difficult people. So by reflecting on equanimity, we can reduce our attachment and thereby make sure our loving kindness is not being polluted. Equanimity also has its own near enemy, because equanimity is this equal attitude towards others. Something that seems to be that, but is actually an enemy, is indifference. We can develop an equal indifference for everyone. This is not equanimity. So if we see that our equanimity is degenerating into simply being equally indifferent to everyone, what can help overcome that is to reflect on compassion. Because it's difficult to remain indifferent when we look at and reflect on the suffering of ourselves and others. Very difficult to stay indifferent. Also, compassion has a near enemy, and that is compassion sometimes degenerates into simply despair. Meaning that despair means that, we see all this suffering and it's just hopeless. It's just hopeless. So if we see our compassion degenerating into despair, then we need to reflect on the positive side of things. Empathetic joy. So by reflecting on empathetic joy, we have a more balanced view, and that will help avoid compassion falling into despair. Empathetic joy is a rejoicing in the virtues of ourselves and others, but this rejoicing can become very meaningless or frivolous. We rejoice about things that are not meaningful, and even sometimes we rejoice when others are suffering. So if our rejoicing, our empathetic joy becomes more meaningless and just frivolous, then reflect on loving kindness, the wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. Can help to overcome this, for the empathetic joy to stay meaningful. So this is the four immeasurables and how each one can degenerate and how one of the other four immeasurables can help avoid that happening. anything about that? Otherwise I'll go straight back to the equalizing and exchanging. Okay. So equalizing and exchanging self with others. Again, it's a 5-step method for cultivating bodhicitta. So the first step is to simply equalize self with others. And equalizing self with others is very similar to the idea of equanimity, and that is to put ourselves at the same level as everyone else, because now we often tend to feel as if my happiness is more important than everyone else. So equalizing self with others is to really appreciate that my happiness is no more important than the happiness of anyone else. We are all equal in that respect. So that's the line of reflection to ensure that we have that equalizing ourselves with others. And then on that basis, the next two sort of go together. The second step is to reflect on the disadvantages of self-cherishing. Self-cherishing here, of course, is the selfish, self-centered attitude that sees my happiness as more important than the happiness of anyone else. Unfortunately, in our modern society, this idea of self-cherishing is often very much promoted, you know, the idea of you need to look after number one. You're the most important. You need to really look after your own happiness, even to the expense of others, because you're the most important. It might seem that this attitude is good for us in terms of our happiness, but actually, if we reflect on it, it's our worst enemy. And it only brings suffering. Because if we become obsessed with me and my happiness and me and my suffering, then often what happens is, particularly the obsessed about me and my suffering, if we're obsessed with that, then often people who have that strong obsession often develop a lot of fear and anxiety about the world. Everything out there is a potential threat to me, even my best friend, so I better be on guard. So then it becomes very stressful because we can never relax, because we may be manipulated or taken advantage of at any moment, so we need to be prepared. And then often what happens is we become super sensitive to everything. Any little thing we react because we're on this defensive. And then, of course, what we do to protect ourselves is we build a big wall around ourselves to protect ourselves. And of course, when we do that, we cut ourselves off from everything else, and we feel very lonely and isolated. And this idea that this self-cherishing is very stressful was highlighted in a medical study recently. A very extensive medical study. I think it was either done in the US or Europe. And the result of the medical study was that people who use the words I, me, and mine a lot have a 35% greater risk of heart attack. So we can see how quite stressful it is. And then, of course, if we become obsessed about me and my happiness, then often that translates into a lot of craving for stuff. And then, of course, if we don't get that stuff, we have a lot of frustration. And even if we get that stuff, we're never really fully satisfied, and we simply end up craving for more. And then, of course, eventually we realize that nothing's satisfying us, and then often we end up very disappointed, even to the point of depression. Also, of course, if we have this self-cherishing, then we have an exaggerated sense of self-importance. You know, I'm the most important. What that translates into is often a lack of consideration and respect for others. And then, of course, if we see others who seem to have more than us, that translates into jealousy. And when we see people at more or less our own level, that often translates into competitiveness, trying to outdo them and put them down. And if we see people around us who seem to be at a lower level than us, it often translates into a very arrogant and dismissive attitude of them. And then, of course, if me and my happiness is the most important thing, then we'll even go to the extent of harming anyone who stands in the way of our happiness. And generally, if we harm others in the pursuit of happiness, they harm us back. And then often, if we do that harm, in the back of our mind, we understand it's not the right thing to do, and then we end up feeling a lot of guilt and low self-esteem as well. And then, as I mentioned, with this me attitude, then we see ourselves as the center of the world. And we tend to have a very narrow perspective. We tend to, as we just saw just now, is because of that narrow perspective, we categorize people into these three groups solely on the perspective of how they're affecting us. And so then we end up with a lot of attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, and hostility, anger, and hatred to difficult people. Then, of course, when it comes to developing loving kindness and compassion to anyone, almost impossible. Loving kindness and compassion to friends, okay, but only as long as they keep saying and doing things that make me happy. Otherwise, no. Loving kindness and compassion to strangers, not really. I couldn't care less what happens to them because they're not affecting me. Loving kindness and compassion to difficult people, no way. In fact, I hope they suffer. They deserve to suffer because they're harming me. So it becomes impossible to really develop loving kindness and compassion to anyone in any meaningful, pure way. So these are some of the disadvantages of the self-cherishing mind. So if we can really reflect on that, we'll come to appreciate that this selfish attitude, which superficially may seem to be our best friend bringing us happiness, is actually our worst enemy. And then together with that, the third point is to reflect on the advantages of cherishing others. Before I talk about that, there was a question.
I was wondering if self-cherishing and self-autonomous is the same.
And self?
Autonomous self. Is it the same thing?
Well, what we can understand is that here, when we use the word self-cherishing, we're using the word self simply to mean myself versus others. But it is true that this self-cherishing can only come from self-grasping. So self-grasping is grasping onto there's an independent me here or autonomous me. The self-cherishing can only come from that.
Okay.
But when we talk about self-cherishing, we're not talking about, we're only really talking about cherishing ourselves versus others, that's all. And then we can reflect on the advantages of cherishing others. And the advantages of cherishing others is basically the opposite of the disadvantages of self-cherishing. For example, if we're really cherishing others, then we're not going to be obsessed about me and my happiness, me and my suffering. So we're not going to have all this fear and anxiety about the world. We're not going to need to build a big wall and be disconnected and lonely. In fact, we'll feel much more connected with others. And in terms of happiness, we're not going to have all this craving and frustration and dissatisfaction. And then, of course, we won't have an exaggerated sense of self-importance, which means that we will show consideration and respect for others. And instead of jealousy, competitiveness, and arrogance, then if someone else does something good or has something good happen, instead of jealousy, we'll be happy. And instead of being competitive, we'll be trying to help others, particularly if they seem to have less than us. And then, of course, we will not harm others in the pursuit of our happiness. And we won't end up with this attachment to friends, apathy to strangers, and hostility, anger, and hatred to difficult people, that will be more easily able to develop loving kindness and compassion towards everyone. So these are the reflecting on the advantages of cherishing others. One point I think it's important to understand here, that often people get into difficulties with this, is what do we really mean by cherishing others? And to highlight this, I want to give a little story, true story. Some years ago, when I was teaching in Tishita in Dharamsala, there was, actually it wasn't in my class, he came later. There was a Danish school teacher in the class. He was teaching primary school children. And he heard about this idea of cherishing others, and he thought, this is a great idea. I want to really implement that with my children, school children, when I go home to Denmark. So when he went back, he tried to implement this idea of cherishing others with his school children, and the class went crazy. Started misbehaving, creating a big mess. And then he had a problem, because he really felt that cherishing others was the right thing to do, but the result was a mess. But then slowly he understood what it meant to cherish others. To cherish others, of course, it means to benefit others, to help others. So if others are misbehaving, to cherish them is to show to them that this is harmful behavior, to help them to overcome that negative behavior. So to really cherish school children means to discipline them if they are misbehaving, to show them that this is not acceptable behavior. So therefore, with cherishing others and compassion in general, we need to always make sure we have wisdom with that. Otherwise, you're going to find cherishing others or compassion will not give a good result. Because one of the things that often happens is it's not very common in our modern society, unfortunately, that people spontaneously help others. So often what happens is when someone is willing to spontaneously help others, then the other person starts to take advantage of that. And then, of course, we've all had that probably many times. We try to help someone and then they try to take advantage of us. And then we're sort of stuck. We think, well,